There were spaces where I was a little bit hesitant. I would say the biggest section for me was the sections about faith and the sections about sex and sexuality. And those things kind of go together. I think there are a lot of very strong opinions in the Black community when it comes to faith, when it comes to what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, how you should live your life, how you shouldn't live your life. And I'm like, do I really want to write this book talking about when I lost my virginity and knowing like my pastor is going to read it, but also talking about the complexity that comes along with those feelings, and is the church right in what they're saying? Because a lot of, I think my experience with the church has been a lot of trauma. And I'll add to, when I use the word trauma, I define it in my book as anything that negatively affects the way that you see yourself, the world, or God. And sometimes those things can be very big. We think about deaths or divorces, but sometimes they can be very small traumas, very small slights. Even today, I just moved out of my old house, and so I was going through the final walkthrough with the agent, and he looked at me and asked, Kiara Imani, Esquire? And I said, yes. And his response was, you don't look like an attorney. I wasn't expecting you to look like this at all.
Today still?
Yeah, this morning. And I don't think he was coming from a malicious space, but I would define that as like a micro trauma. It's not something that, is life shattering, but all of a sudden you're questioning, well, what does an attorney look like? What does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be a Black woman? What does it mean to be a young Black woman? And when you have a lot of these micro traumas stacked on top of each other, they can really start to affect you in the same way that a big trauma would. So I do my best in the book to walk through a lot of the conversations and experiences that I consider micro traumas that add up over time. And my hope is that people will read and start to think about the micro traumas in their own lives and like, wow, yeah, I went through that. And maybe that's why I'm feeling that way about that thing. Or maybe that's why I look in the mirror every morning and think like, you're not pretty enough. Maybe one of my classmates told me that they only date white girls. And so now I'm asking myself, are white girls prettier than I? Just all of those things. So it was a little bit scary, I think, being that authentic in some of my chapters. And then I also talk about an eating disorder with my sister, and I ran that by her and asked her how she felt about that. And, she was like, tell my story if it could help anybody else, if the struggle to be perfect, this perfection struggle and how that can affect us, then by all means share it. And so I really am in a place where I believe that being radically honest with ourselves and with others not only sets ourselves free, but it can also set somebody else free.
So say what you said about how you define trauma, because I think that is so good. It's anything that affects the way you see yourself.
Anything that negatively affects the way you see yourself, the world, or God.
That's such an interesting definition, particularly the self and the God part. It just so stands out to me because I see people who have grown up in the church and have negative experiences that when you even mention like, religion and God, there is this visceral reaction to it. And that really, that's trauma. I mean, when you see somebody, just their body reacts to it and is really not listening to what you're actually saying, that's such a really good way to define it. At what point in writing your book did you feel, because during the process of it, you're probably learning stuff about yourself. So you go in saying, I'm going to tell my story. This is what it's going to look like. And then at the end of it, were there things that you learned about yourself and your experiences that you didn't know at the beginning?
It was, I would say, primarily the faith piece was the one that shook me a lot, because I wrote my outline. I'm like, I processed through this with my therapist. I'm good. But then when I started actually writing about some of the experiences I've had in church, some of the experiences I've had with pastors, pastors who are well-meaning and are continuously asking me about things having to do with sex and sexuality. Are you a virgin? Oh, you're dating someone. Are you sleeping with them? Questions that are very invasive. And you might be a pastor, but you're also a grown man, and I'm a young woman. And these conversations probably aren't appropriate. So just processing through a lot of that, because for a lot of us, and I do consider myself a believer, if you believe in God or whoever it is that you believe in, that's a huge foundation for who you are, what your purpose is, your moral compass. So when you start to question, what are these messages that are being passed down about homosexuality, about what it means to be trans, about I've being on the radio, I get lots of strong opinions all the time. If you're a man and you wear earrings, then you're going to hell because you're dressing like a woman. There are just so many strong opinions. And then when you actually try to break that down, it can get real deep because it's like, okay, so I've been living my life this way, but is that way wrong? And then obviously throughout history, I think there have been a lot of evil things done in the name of lots of different religions, which I attribute to man, not necessarily to God. Mm-hmm. But when you see, people who confess to be Christians in church talking about they don't care if a Black person was shot down in the street, they deserved it. It's like, so you believe that and I believe this. How can we both be like the same religion? How can we both be believers? Because we have very different fundamental ideas about what it means to be a believer. And then maybe we believe something different about who God is. So that for me was really challenging and really forced me to go, actually, I would say deeper. There's this term, I don't know if you've heard, deconstruction, that has gotten a really bad rap in faith communities, but I actually believe it's the best thing that you can do for yourself because it allows you to just knock down everything that you were taught and to then build up brick by brick for yourself what faith means to you.
Deconstruction sounds like a positive thing to me. It sounds like somebody trying to understand something, but I actually am not familiar with the term. But I can gather it means where you're actually questioning your faith and taking it apart piece by piece.
Yeah, and right, it sounds positive, but there have been a lot of pastors and in books I've read that says if you're deconstructing, it's the work of the devil because he's trying to make you believe that you know what's happening and your heart is wicked and deceptive and you can't trust yourself. So there's no way that you should be taking the authority to deconstruct and figure out faith for yourself. You need a male pastor to tell you who God is and what the Bible means to you. And just the idea that a lot of people use faith to make us believe that we can't trust ourselves, when my life experience says God is in me and learning to sit with myself and trust myself has always led me in the right direction.
That is really so interesting. Yeah. And does that lack of questioning or the encouraging the lack of questioning then apply to other parts of yourself that isn't faith?
Yeah, I think and I can only speak for myself. There are a lot of things that I suppressed and didn't question because from a very young age, we're thought to obey authorities. And I'm not saying that in the right circumstance, in a space that you trust, obeying authority is wrong. But sometimes authority is not right. For years, slavery was legal in the United States. And it was the authorities that were holding that law in place. There have been lots of things that authorities have put in place that are actually harmful and detrimental. And pastors are people. Teachers are people. Parents are people. I've talked to so many friends who tell me in their adult years, they've really had to tune out their parents' voice, unfortunately, in a lot of spaces, and realize that they're suffering a lot of trauma, which probably is generational. Their parents suffered a trauma. So they're just passing on whatever it is they know. So it can play out in so many different spaces, not in just faith, but just that message of trust somebody else. Somebody else knows you better than you, I think is really harmful.
Hey, everybody, please support independent journalism based on the truth by going to patreon.com/HermelaTV and becoming a member. Thank you so much for your support.